Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining this scheduled webinar today. Thank you very much for Birmingham Law Society for arranging this, and thank you to all of you who have taken time out of your busy and hectic schedules to join us for what should be between 40 minutes to an hour just to go through and talk about climate change and the Law Society guidance that was released back in April. For those who don't know who Landmark are, we are the leading provider of environmental searches to law firms. We're both Landmark branded searches and the detailed consultant searches by Argyle, which you may be familiar with both or either one of those. As I said, today we're talking about what has become, I suppose, quite a contentious topic in light of the guidance that was released back in April. While I think it's fair to say that there are mixed views, shall we say, on the guidance itself, it is inevitably here to stay nonetheless, and it is an important issue to understand and be aware of. So just very quickly, just to introduce to you myself and my colleague Sally, who will be speaking to you today. I'm Mark Taylor, and I'm joined by my colleague Sally. We both have had very similar, I suppose, backgrounds within Landmark and Argyle, so our introductions don't vary too dramatically. We both were environmental consultants with the Argyle business area and as well as Landmark. More recently, my role is now as I suppose a key stakeholder for our clients in terms of environmental risk awareness, continued development, and how varying searches help achieve this to varying degrees. And Sally is an environmental consultant who also works as a customer success consultant, training our clients on all aspects of environmental risks. And she's also headed up the net zero strategy for Landmark as an entire business and has been critical in its adoption. So an expert in net zero uptake as well. What we will look to cover. So really the goal of the session is to hopefully simplify the guidance for you all, I suppose what it means for practitioners in terms of what risks it talks about in terms of looking to start to cover and start to understand, and what Sally will cover especially towards the end is I suppose those practical steps you can start to take as and when you define a policy on how you want to start looking at climate change risks as a firm or as a practicing solicitor. I think a lot of you will be familiar with a lot of this in general, I suppose, in terms of the context of duties and responsibilities. It's just adapting that to include climate change. I suppose first half will therefore be interpreting the guidance and how you can look to start to advise on climate risks with elements of, again, what has been referenced in the guidance from a risk perspective. And the second half will be looking at how information can be passed on to solicitor, and what key elements of the Landmark search, the Landmark search that exists, and what features and where it adds value. So just starting off with the Law Society guidance in general. So it was released on the 19th of April. I presume most people are aware, well, I hope everyone's aware of it, and I hope a lot of people have already read it. But during its creation, there's a lot of consultation, or in parts consultation, on its content and I think its length for some degree. And Landmark were not obviously a direct consultee in it. However, our legal director, Simon Boyle, was through the United Kingdom Environmental Law Association, which he is a member of, and I did, as far as I'm aware, see a draft prior to its release. I think one thing to note is it's quite a long, hefty piece of guidance. It's longer than others have been released, such as contaminated land and for flooding, and also it's in two distinct parts. Part A is a big section on reducing your emissions and your clients to the extent of in terms of advising them, and then Part B, which is the main focus of this session, is going to be on how to start to look to advise clients in respect to climate change risks. Now, I think there is, being two distinct and important areas, there is, a discussion that could suggest that maybe this could have been two documents in itself, but really, I think whilst they are two big topics individually, they do work together quite well in the sense of, if we're talking about the impacts of climate change, I suppose from a property perspective, physical risk changes is going to potentially be key. The impact of those, or the change experienced in those physical risks, is going to be largely driven by Part A of the guidance. How quickly do we reduce our emissions, and then who's involved in doing that? So in terms of a story around how climate change how significant climate change could get, I suppose, and then what needs to happen to minimize that, Part A come before Part B, I think does work quite well, because it does provide that link between the physical aspects of risk change, but also the transitional requirements that's needed I suppose, by all businesses in the UK to meet net zero targets. So in the first instance, who should read the guidance? Very simple question. Well, firstly, it's really everyone in the Law Society. As it's not specific to any sector at the moment, it's basically saying all solicitors need to start thinking about climate change and the impact it could have on the advice you give and I suppose the clients you work with. And so in terms of an answer, it's quite simple. Solicitors need to start thinking about climate change. If you haven't already, we recommend reading the guidelines, start to get comfortable with, I suppose, the terminology, but the context of climate change being referenced in terms of the duties that already exist. One thing to note about the guidance is that, again, it's quite general at the moment, and it does say within it that there will be, in terms of future releases, sector-specific guidance coming out. And it is thought that the first one of these is likely to be on property and real estate. I think the key thing on this is that this has not been drafted yet, or as far as I'm aware, this has not been drafted yet, and therefore it is unknown when it will definitely be released. But there is the expectation that more sector-specific guidance will come out. Our understanding is that it's not going to be like, I say, contaminated land guidance, where it's going to say you must always do this. It's unlikely to be that. And really, I suppose it's more likely to be, I suppose, fleshing out what it already discusses in this guidance. And I think an element of that could be, more specific, I suppose, narration around, what physical risks do we think are important to cover, because it doesn't really do that at the moment, and maybe a bit more detail on the aspects of transition risk that really could affect property. However, one thing that we're hearing that some firms are waiting for this sector-specific guidance to come out, may be thinking it'd be a bit more prescriptive in what they expect lawyers or solicitors to do. I think that's unlikely to be the case, or I say we think that's unlikely to be the case. So if you're waiting for this guidance to come out to say, in this situation, you should be doing A, B, and C, or in this situation, you should be looking at or questioning A, B, C, and D, we think at the moment that is going to be unlikely. And so therefore, really, the advice now would be, start to review what you're going to do now and how you want to approach it if you haven't started doing that already. So advising your clients. So before we jump into, I suppose, the guidance more specifically, I think to provide a bit of content and context, a little reminder of the science and what kind of change the data is suggesting we could see from climate risk if we don't get a grip on the transition elements, as I suppose, the nation or the globe. And starting with the science behind the targets, behind the commitments, the policy and legislation that we hear about, I suppose, quite regularly at the moment, it is the science itself. And those with arguably the most expertise will report as part of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their first report was in 1990, and the snippet attached on this slide is from the latest IPCC report, which was published earlier this year and is their sixth synthesis report. Now, over those recent years and decades, there's been quite a strong language change in terms of how vocal the IPCC has been on, I suppose, the impact of human involvement in terms of, climate change and what we're seeing on a global scale. Probably happening, and probably because of anthropogenic activities, was more common in the first types of reports, and that's now changed to a lot more certainly. There is no doubt, according to scientists now, as it says, human activities, principally through emissions of greenhouse gases, have unequivocally caused global warming, with global surface temperatures reaching 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial level. And I think an important context of this is that, well, what does 1.1 degrees mean? It doesn't sound very lot. If we, have a temperature increase on a daily level changing by, 30 to 31 or, 25 to 26, we wouldn't really bat an eyelid. It wouldn't really be too fussed. But in the context of the Paris Agreement is hoping to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And in that sense, then, we're already over two-thirds of the way there, and already experiencing quite significant change in areas of the world. And so, being already two-thirds of the way there, it just shows that that the scale of the change that's needed to happen to start to really manage and control, I suppose, the releasing of greenhouse gases. And so, the next question really then from that is, I suppose, where are we going with this? Well, as I said, what we do know is that we're not going to stop at 1.1 degrees. Global emissions are still increasing, and in 2022, there was an increase of over 1% in global emissions from 2021. The image you can see on this slide is taken from that IPCC report, which we previously mentioned, and I suppose provides a depiction of the hazardous world we could end up in if we don't start to act around our emissions now and more seriously. And so how hot the planet inevitably gets is going to be down to significant policy around emission reduction and, where necessary, carbon capture policies, whether that's through technology advancements or natural means, restoration of carbon capturing environments such as forests, seas and peat bogs. But again, referring back to the Paris Agreement, what I think we don't contextualize is that the level of change that we're hoping to limit to is still not ideal. That's still a further increase in global temperatures. And in so much that actually means that it's the best case, it's the best of a bad bunch of options, and it could still be a lot worse if we're not managing this as close as we should. At the moment, the current projection is estimated to be between 2 degrees and 3 degrees, and it's hard to see on the slide, but that was the temperature, or we haven't seen temperatures across the globe on that scale since 3 million years ago. So it's a significant change that we're still potentially moving towards. So that's kind of I suppose the background, of the importance of looking at climate change and how it may, and what scenario we could potentially end up in, and what options there are if we don't tackle and reach the targets that we set out for ourselves. And within the guidance, it sets out 3 different types of risk: physical, transition and litigation. And physical and transition risks are written very commonly across most guidance that you would see in relation to climate change, whether that's from the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, whether that's the Bank of England, whether that's the UK government, whether it's the Better Building Partnership. But starting with physical, I suppose with the exception of heat stress, most of these risks, I imagine everyone will be generally familiar with, either through environmental reports or the news. And so these are generally risks that we all live in, in any given year. These incidents could happen, but essentially what climate change is going to potentially do is make these incidents more frequent and perhaps more extreme, and so therefore leading to exacerbating the issues that we already face. If we go for these one by one, if we start with flooding, again, flooding is something that a lot of people will already be doing as part of environmental due diligence during a transaction. So flooding data and flooding risk is very commonly known, I suppose, across the industry. How climate change may exacerbate this is that the 2, I suppose, key factors of climate change in terms of temperature will be milder and wetter winters and drier and hotter summers. So during winter months, we can expect more extreme, stronger storm events. But in the summer months, whilst they're likely to be drier and hotter, what that will lead to is, when storms do happen, is going to lead to a greater threat or greater risk of flash flooding. Drier soils will be harder to infiltrate, and so therefore any water falling onto that surface through rainfall will therefore run off on the surface, not infiltrating the ground as it should, to get into that natural hydrological cycle. What that also may potentially lead to is greater erosion, as there's more water on the surface running at faster velocities. Next risk is subsidence. Again, this is something that's a core part of most environmental reports as well, so a risk that a lot of people would be common with. And I suppose the element of subsidence risk is that it could likely be quite geological dependent, in a sense of the BGS break up, I suppose, subsidence risk into 6 core risks across the UK, where an area of focus is at the moment really is on clay environments and clay geologies, where in response to rainfall and response to drying out piers, the clay soils can shrink and swell, creating movement. Climate change through, as I said, wetter winters, but drier and hotter summers, that can lead to greater infiltration in winter months and greater saturation and greater swelling. But then as the summer comes along, that will evaporate and dry out, creating greater or more frequent movement in those soils. And so therefore subsidence claims may increase through that shrink and swelling of clays in response to drier, hotter summers and milder, wetter winters. Coastal erosion. Areas of the coast naturally going to be susceptible to erosion, and as a risk, this is, I suppose, shot to prominence, especially this year, as there's been widespread attention in the area of Hornsby in Norfolk, where a number of properties have already been, I suppose, evacuated to some degree and are being demolished as the coast creeps ever forward through that area. And so sea level increase, more extreme and more frequent storms will potentially worsen this. And I think greater reporting on this issue is highlighting the issue of coastal properties in some areas, and is driving attention to this, and is probably one of the more, the risk that's seen, that's really evidencing how climate change is causing issues in coastal environments. Finally, heat stress and fire. And so heat stress, I suppose, is probably one of the easiest ones to communicate. If it's hotter outside, buildings will naturally get hotter inside, especially if ventilation is poor in that building. Fire at the moment is something that's not really thought about in this country, I suppose, from a risk management, but also a risk perspective. We're not exposed like other countries like Australia or California, where you see extremely significant, long drawn out, huge areas of fire. And so it's interesting that this is a risk that's specifically referenced in the guidance, and it's something that I suppose reports will have to start to investigate. It has already been referenced, but as we saw last summer, fire risk, wildfires is an issue in some areas of the country, and unfortunately, it did lead to a few properties being burnt down last summer when we saw those really extreme temperatures of plus 40 degrees in areas of the country. So at this point, I think it's important just to touch on the data. And so the data that's used to drive, I suppose, risk change and drive assessments is the Met Office data. It's United Kingdom Climate Projections 18, and it said this powers climate change assessments. The UK CPAT Met Office data is the most authoritative data in the UK for predicting future weather events and future weather change, in the UK. And within the data, there are 4 different scenarios in effect that play out different outcomes that we could experience and potential future scenarios. As you can see from the slide, they go from RCP 2.6, Representative Concentration Pathway 2.6, and this is the pathway that's aligned to the Paris Agreement, through to 2 intermediate scenarios, and to RCP 8.5 at the top, which is, I suppose, is the extreme scenario where emissions continue to grow unmitigated. I suppose the extreme unlikely scenario, you could say. And what's important to note is obviously that each scenario leads to a different temperature increase over time. And as you can see from the graph, that change isn't too significant up to 2040, but at that point it starts to deviate quite significantly. And if we look at where those lines end up in 2100, they are extremely significant, extremely different, I suppose, scenarios that could play out. And so an assessment of risk change in a search to obtain will be derived from one of these 4 scenarios. And that is important to be aware of, as obviously a more extreme scenario will report more extreme change. Looking at the top to the bottom, Paris Agreement hoping to maintain temperature between 1 and 2 degrees by 2100. RCP 8.5, emissions continue to grow unmitigated up to around 5 degrees. So a significant difference in the environment that we'd like to see. Therefore, when adopting a policy, I suppose it should be an important consideration, something you should be aware of, because in effect, what information will you be returning to your client? If it's an extreme scenario, then it's going to create more change. But if it's a lower or intermediate scenario, it's likely to generate less change. So that's just something to be aware of, because there are 4 different scenarios that something could be deriving an assessment from. So that's the physical risk element. I think that's probably the risk that people are going to be more comfortable with and more confident in discussing. And the other key element of risk is something called transition risks. And I suppose transitional risks is likely to be new terminology to a lot of people. And while new, it's important to be aware that this will be an important issue to be aware of and consider if or when reporting on climate risks. I think this is an area where there could be some simplification, and its definition in terms of what it means made a bit clearer. I think that's just generally. The Bank of England, I think, separates physical and transition risks out really simply. They set out transition risks as on the slide. You can think of these as changes that governments, industries, and consumers make in pursuit of a greener world. And so that's what they describe the transition risk element as. And so this is similarly echoed by the UK government in their climate change strategy 2021 to 2024. And they say transition risks are the financial risks which could result from the process of adjustment towards a lower carbon economy, including change in policy and technology, which could prompt a reassessment of asset values and lead to stranded assets. So simply put, transition risks are changes that need to occur in terms of policy, regulation, and technology to reach our net zero targets. And so I suppose in terms of real estate, yes, perception of risk is likely to change, whether that's by individuals or businesses, and that is important to understand. However, in pursuit of a lower carbon economy, in pursuit of a greener world, energy efficiency is therefore, I suppose, the key transition risk of concern to real estate, as we will need to reduce the carbon output of both commercial and domestic properties to reach net zero. There already existing laws to make it legal to lease commercial property that have an EPC rating that is either F or G, and government white papers on changes to MEES have already been consulted on, which will have big implications to the private rented sector for both domestic properties and commercial real estate. A lot will also need to be done if the government wants to meet their aspiration for as many homes as possible to reach EPC Band C by 2035. So this is laid out in the guidance within Part B 2.1, climate change risks and climate legal risks. And firstly, the guidance states, in this guidance, we address climate legal risks. However, climate change transition and climate change physical risks will impact upon a solicitor's consideration of climate legal risks. From this, it then goes into several bullet points, addressing certain topics of potential risks. And while there is a subheading for physical risk, there is not a specific bullet point stating transition risk. I think this could have been useful because, transition risk is really clear and consistent within the guidance, and it continuously references both. So I think that's something that could perhaps have helped. However, it is important to note that minimum energy efficiency standards are covered by the guidance within this section, and is within the subheading new climate related legislation and regulations, so which include disclosure and reporting requirements, greenwashing regulation, minimum energy efficiency standards, investment labels, ultra low emission zones, advertising and market standards, and electrical vehicles. So it is specifically referenced within the guidance. It's just under new climate related legislation and regulation, not a separate bullet point stating transition risk. In the back as well, so 5.3 Annex 3, they have an initial point of guidance that's just dated as checklist for legal practices. And they provide just, I suppose, a quick checklist to assist with starting to implement the guidance and start to raise some initial questions, which again revert directly back to physical and transition risks in terms of language. So have you reviewed the physical and transition risks associated with the transaction? So again, there was consistency in what risks could potentially be present in transaction, and therefore there needs to be awareness of both. And again, for real estate, energy efficiency and current and future MEES policy will be a transition risk to perhaps start discussing with clients. I suppose the reason why transition risk is really important is because I suppose it needs to be done. And again, as I said at the beginning, the sooner and faster we react to the transition challenges we have, the better chance we'll be in to minimize the future change around physical risks. And I suppose the problem is at the moment is that analysis of current UK policy has concluded that targets have not been met by effective policy. The House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee published a report called the Net Zero Transformation, Delivery, Regulation and Consumer Report. And that concluded the government is likely to miss its target for reducing emissions to net zero by 2050 unless it puts in place credible plans which are needed to encourage essential investment by consumers and businesses. In June last year, the Committee on Climate Change assessed the government's plans for reducing emissions in all sectors of the economy. They found that only 39% of the required emission savings are backed up by credible plans or policies. In July 2022, the High Court ruled that the government's net zero strategy failed to outline policies that would enable us to meet our targets. And since then, the government has published a new plan, which was released on March the 30th. And so I suppose, what does this mean? Well, we've already mentioned that the UK government has done consultation papers on, I suppose, further restricting MEES regulations in terms of what EPCs are acceptable by what date. However, if we're in a place where policy is failing and further policy fails down the line, or they're not aligned, I suppose, to meet our targets, it is likely, or I suppose even inevitable, that more stringent policy may need to be implemented. And as we lose time, it will need to be implemented at a faster rate. And that's why transition risk is a really important factor in, I suppose, the climate change risk conversation. So last of the three risks, liability risks. Well, climate change litigation could be and is actually being brought about by people bringing claims against businesses. And in terms of real estate, after discussing this with our legal director, there are, I suppose, several ways in which this potentially could occur. And so point one, failing to exclude or warn of climate change risk in a retainer and then not considering climate change risk during the transaction. So I suppose failing to exclude, failing to warn since the guidance has been released. Failing to consider climate change risk in an obvious location. I think this one might be a bit contentious, but in effect, if you're in an area of the country which is likely to be at risk to change, I think if we look at Hemsby now, if there was a solicitor acting in that location, and a property was near to the coastline, is that arguably an obvious location where climate change could impact or is already impacting that environment? As a third point, failing to advise the clients on risks identified in the climate change search. I think this is reflecting back to the Bird and Bird case, if you're obtaining information about this, it's important to summarize that information and pass that to the client. Or if you obtain information during due diligence, not necessarily undertaken through a search you've undertaken yourself, but perhaps by a third-party pre-contract inquiries, this also needs to be taken into consideration and passed to the client for advice. And so there are some areas where a liability risk in conveyancing, I suppose, in real estate could potentially arise, something to be aware of. A big part of the guidance then is, as I suppose, is the duties, and it's not redefining them specifically, really. It's just stating that these obviously duties exist, which you will be all aware of, I imagine, and it's just highlighting that that climate change needs to start falling into that. And so it really just is essentially just reiterating those key points. So firstly, duty of care. I presume you all know you have a duty of care. However, solicitors may have to look beyond the narrow scope of instruction by a client to consider whether and to what extent climate legal risks are relevant. So yes, you're all going to know you have a duty of care to your clients, and that needs to start being considered in I suppose, in the realms of what impact could climate change have on this in terms of what transaction I'm doing. Duty to warn. So a solicitor has a duty to warn a client about potential risk by pointing out hazards of which kind, which should be obvious to the solicitor, but the client may not appreciate. And so really, given the guidance has been released now, I suppose you should have, or you could have more awareness of climate change as a potential issue in a transaction than, say, a general member of the public or a client of yours. And so really, now the guidance has been published, you need to read, you need to be aware that there are searches that can be obtained if required, and aware of risks because your client may not effectively. As a side point to that, the guidance does state that on the counter side of it, you may be working with clients or organisations that do have a very good understanding of this already, and so obviously therefore that is also something to take into account. But really, again, it's simply raising the question: have you started thinking about climate change yet to your clients? Arguably the most important one, if you're getting a climate change report and there's important information in there, or any information there that references change, then it needs to be extracted, or it should be extracted and sent on to your client. If reports are being sent, making sure it's being made aware of and pointing out to what a particular section you think is of particular, I suppose, importance and should be raised to their attention. And then finally, duty to uphold service and competent levels. I think the thing to pull out here is that within the guidance, there's an understanding that solicitors may not, and in a lot of cases probably won't, have experience or knowledge or training, I suppose, in place to provide a high service level on climate change. And therefore, there's an acknowledgement that upskilling is going to be required in terms of climate change as a topic to start commenting on. I think the expectation will therefore be on the law firm to start to, if they don't have that experience or knowledge, to start to adapt and ensure that there is a process and timeline in place for this, I suppose, competency to increase around climate risks. And finally, part C 5.1, property due diligence. What does the guidance say? Well, it doesn't say a huge amount in terms of the advice. Consider the impacts of physical events on conveyancing transactions. Is a climate search needed? And so again, it's kind of referencing that there's professional judgment at play here. You're the ones advising your clients, but your client may also have a view on that. But again, it's why starting to have that conversation internally about what policy you want to take towards searches is important now. So generally speaking, what to say about property due diligence? Well, the guidance doesn't say it's necessary. The guidance does not say it is necessary to undertake a climate change search in all time. And then again, it kind of goes back to that whole professional judgment aspect of a solicitor's role. And really, then it's up to a firm to set a policy as it sees appropriate. And there are several firms taking different approaches to this. But again, I think the key thing is really around this is understanding the guidance, reading it, and basing your policy on I suppose the level of service that you want to provide and the significance of that you feel climate change plays in the transaction you'll be advising on. But really, acknowledgement of the risk, acknowledgement of the guidance, and that if there are training and competency gaps, they need to be filled. But there is a key thing around really. There's a general recognition that this is a fast-moving area, and policies will evolve. One thing we've done is we've created some client care wording to assist anyone in terms of warning their client really on risk, but also defining that policy. And so again, as I said in the previous slide, not everyone's approaching this in the same way. Different firms are approaching it differently based upon, I suppose, the clients they work with, the work they do, and I suppose the policy they want to set. And so we've created flexible wording really so that a policy can be defined by the firm, not by the search itself. And so really the one of three options that you could take. Yes, we have the wording there to provide the warning to the client, but that policy following that could be the client requesting a search from you. It could be you stating that we're going to get a search and you tell us not to, so a more of a search by default stance. Or there could be, we're warning you of these risks. However, we're not looking to include this within your search pack. Please tell us if you want us to. So there are three different approaches that can be taken from the client care wording that we've created, and we really hope that that's helpful towards implementing a policy and warning your clients of potential risks of climate change. This is just a quick pause moment, so I'll be handing over to my colleague Sally just in a second. But what should happen very quickly is a poll should pop up on your screen, which would launch now. And basically, what would be great to get your feedback on is what are your thoughts really on the guidance at the moment in relation to the practice that your firm may look to take? What do you see as being the appropriate step in terms of the options that I just laid out? This is something we'll do by default unless you tell us you don't want it. We recommend it. Tell us if you'd like it, or in the third instance, we'll warn you of these risks. We're not looking to undertake a search, but we will if you see this risk as important to cover. So yeah, if everyone could quickly just fill in, just answer the poll and submit as it arises. How are we getting on in terms of the poll? Is everyone selected? 100% answered. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. And I'm just going to hand you over to my colleague Sally, who will get up the second half of the session.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just share my screen now. And Mark, just to check, can you just see my slides?
Yeah, you're good.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So yeah, thanks, Mark, for introducing me to the presentation. So the next few slides, we just go through how do you report climate change risks to your clients. So first of all, we've made the assumption that you've ordered a climate change report. So once that's obtained, the main thing to do then is to review the report and make sure that you understand what the outcomes are. The climate change report's been designed to be easy to understand. It's very visual, so hopefully you can pick up any particular issues for your client. Secondly, then it's emailing a copy of the search to your client and then making sure that they're aware of any particular issues. The main things that you would look at is to see if any of those risks have changed from the current day to 2050. For instance, if it's flood risk and it's low to moderate now, but in the future, in 20 years' time, it's a moderate or moderate to high, then definitely something that should be raised to the client, just because insurance premiums may increase. If any of these issues might not mean that the client does not want to go ahead with the transaction, but it just makes sure that they're aware of any particular issues, and just if any risk is increased, it's important for them just to be aware of that. And then copying and pasting the summary of the report into your report on title. And there's lots of guidance now from the Chancery Lane project, which is the way of drafting for climate change. And this particular one on the screen is Marnie's clause, where a climate change search has been requested by the client. And the solicitor can use this particular clause to show what risks have been reported within the climate change report. So you'll see here that you've got physical risks, and a number of different risks that have been highlighted. And one of the things that you can do is use these and then put down what the risk is currently and whether that risk has increased. You can also see here that they've also mentioned transition risks, and as Mark's mentioned, it's based on how we move from a lower carbon economy and the potential risk associated with that. So in particular, for this particular clause, it's mentioned about insurability and the changes to that, and also property value and the cost to either maintain or retrofit. And I'll go through later on in the presentation about a particular transition risk that we've highlighted within our report. So when you're including the results of a climate change report, this is a potential example that you could write within your report and title. So we've carried out a landmark climate change report. This identified the following risks and then identify what those risks are. We'd recommend that you speak to a contact or environmental consultant at Landmark if you have any questions about this report or the risks identified. And you could potentially speak to a surveyor, but because we have our own in-house environmental consultants who are already reporting on all of the other environmental risks, and we're writing those climate change reports, it's best really to speak to us because we understand how the report's being made, what the data is behind that, what those risks mean, and also what the next steps are. And we've always been happy to help answer any questions from yourselves or from your clients. So definitely, if there are any questions, please feel free to contact us, where we're happy to help. So when you're copying and pasting any of the summaries of our of the changes of risk within the climate change report, this is potentially an area that you could copy and paste. So I'll go through the report in more detail in a second, but each page will have a particular hazard and then what those risks are. And here you can see for flooding that the risk has increased from low to moderate present day to moderate 2050. And it's just, you can either copy and paste it or write down that summary within your report and title. But really, when you're looking at this, it's any change or increase in risk that should be highlighted to the client. So just going through the climate change report now. The report itself, we've got two versions. One's for residential, one's for commercial. They both cover exactly the same risk topics, but they have tailored advice. So for EPC, for instance, where the future EP standards differ between residential and commercial, they'll have different advice. So just when you're ordering a report, just make sure that you're ordering the correct version. We also have an introduction page because we understand that it's a new subject, but there's varying amounts of knowledge between our clients in terms of what climate change means. And there's lots and lots of terminology associated with climate change. So what we've done here is provide this introduction to climate change, gone through how the data is modelled, and identified some of the key terminology. So representative concentration pathways, as Mark's already explained, kind of going through those different types of scenarios and what they mean, because it's something that's heavily reported within our reports. But also going through some of those different hazards that we're also looking at as well, and why we've included it and how climate change could potentially impact on those. And then as we go through each particular hazard, you'll see that we identify the risk. So we do the risk for today and for 2050. We also have stress testing, which I'll go through in more detail in the next couple of slides. But every page will have a recommendation on what to do next, and also some information about why we've included this within our report. When we started to make this report, we had lots of advice from environmental lawyers, PSLs and conveyancers, all of whom said that they needed to have this as a separate report. And it's something that the new guidance has also mentioned, that you don't necessarily need it for every transaction. It's using your professional judgment about whether you need to include one of these or not, because it depends on the type of transaction and it depends on your client's appetite for risk. So really, it's important to have a choice. And so having a separate report, you can either include it as part of your overall due diligence or just include it when you think it's required. I just want to highlight now a few sections within our report that we think are quite important and stand out. First one is looking at transition risk. So as I've said, it's us moving towards a lower carbon economy and how we adapt to some policy changes. The Law Society guidance specifically mentions transition risks. And so when you're wanting to look at a climate change search, it's something that you should be looking for. One of the key transitional risks that we've identified for real estate is energy performance in buildings, because that affects the use and saleability of your property in the future. Especially buildings within the UK are the oldest housing stock within Europe, and it also represents 20% of our total carbon emissions. So it's something that if the UK government are wanting to really work on in regards to net zero, it's something that they're going to have to be quite stringent about with those policies. And we've already mentioned about MEES, which started on the 1st of April 2020, where landlords can no longer let or continue to let properties which have an EPC rating of E. And current government policy expects that to increase up to a C. Again, I can see that increasing further as we move towards net zero, especially if we're becoming quite slow at meeting our targets. It's something that could potentially become even more stringent as we go along the years. So for residential, for the residential report, one of the things that we help identify is what the current property rating for the EPC rating is and what the potential rating could be. And we also highlight the potential cost that might be to increase that energy performance rating. And another aspect that I just want to go through is the stress testing. So you'll see the table here that goes through from 2030, 2050 and 2080, and also goes and has a look at the different RCP values. So we've got 2.6, which is being aligned to the Paris Agreement, 4.5, which is where we're currently heading, and then 8.5, which is the worst case scenario where we're continually emitting greenhouse gases and not wanting to reduce those. So you can see here that with the worst case scenario, obviously the risk ratings associated with flooding is going to be higher than it is if we're meeting the Paris Agreement. But the reasons why we've done this is because different clients have different risk tolerances, as I've mentioned before as well, that different transactions are different in terms of you could have a short-term lease and therefore maybe 2030 is something that they're looking for. You could have the property for a lot longer and therefore potentially even 2080 is something that a client would be looking at. And it's quite good really and transparent to be able to see how those risks will change depending on those different types of scenarios, and it enables then the client to have a clearer vision really of how climate change might impact that property and make a decision from there. So also going on about the climate change guidance, and it mentions about continued learning, especially because it's a new subject. Something that we have and we've had for a while now is a Landmark Academy. It's free to register, There's lots of materials on there, short videos on all types of environmental risks and business compliance. And we also have a section now on climate change, which goes through an introduction to climate change through to different legislations associated with climate change. And we have a 4-part webinar series currently by Professor Robert Lee. The first one's about international law on climate change. And we'll be continuing that across the rest of the month. And we also have our landmark support pack, because again, it is a fairly new subject. We want to try and include as much information as we can. So we have our advice note on climate change. We have our client care letter, which goes through those options that Mark mentioned for policy. Again, our Landmark Academy, which is there to help you with your continued learning. And then we'll also, at the end of this session, provide product card and a sample report.